So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Palencia Mobley. A year ago, I walked away from my job as the Deputy Director and Chief Engineer of the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, where I spent an extensive amount of time developing a post-construction stormwater ordinance, as well as implementing a green infrastructure program management project in which we were required to spend $50 million by 2029. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Adib Dada. I am the founder of the Adib Dada, a regenerative consultancy and architecture firm based out of Lebanon. I'm trained as an architect, but for the past 4 years, I have been planting urban forests in cities across Lebanon, as well as in schools. And my work is really about kind of building habitat for humans and now moving into building habitat for other types of organisms and eventually looking at bringing those two together to build interspecies habitat.
Hello, I am Rachel Silverstein, and I'm the Executive Director and Waterkeeper of local nonprofit Miami Waterkeeper. In short, we work to protect the water you love, and that means always starting with the science and then building policy and advocacy solutions, and then bringing them to the public from grassroots to grass tops advocacy work and outreach and education. So I'm happy to be here providing the local perspective on this question of green infrastructure.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shalini Vajjhala. I am the founder and CEO of a design firm called Refocus Partners, and we work on integrating finance into the design process for large-scale green and nature-based infrastructure. So I want you to think about all those things that would keep you up at night, where success is something that doesn't happen. The storm hit, but the community wasn't flooded. We figure out how you pay for that and build it into the design process.
Awesome. So we're going to jump right in. And I know I set it up a little bit with a binary about green versus gray infrastructure, but Palencia, do you see that as, if this or that, or is it yes and? How do you think they work together?
So ultimately, they have to work together. You can't have green infrastructure without gray infrastructure. You can't have gray without green. The way that we've built most of our cities, concrete rules the world, rooftops rule the world. We don't think about grass and trees and making sure we have enough pervious surfaces planted. Those pervious surfaces allow, for in the case of trees, allow for us to have canopy to intercept rainfall. But furthermore, it also provides shade and cooling for heat island effect, which we all know climate change, or let's call it extreme weather, right? That's what someone said to me yesterday. Extreme weather events, this is the norm now. When I left Detroit about 2 weeks ago, it was 60 degrees. And then when I came back, we had a snowstorm like of epic proportions with ice everywhere that Friday. And so when is it 60 something degrees in February in Detroit? So it has to be a combination of those solutions. And, when we begin to look at gray, we don't even really know what to size gray for now. Most engineers will tell you we're looking at projections of rainfall that, quite honestly, all the climate science does not necessarily agree on. So we don't even know what size to make some of the gray infrastructure. We'll say 100-year storm, which is a 1% chance in any given year that a storm can happen. But that 100-year storm and that precipitation amount now is likely, there's a 10 or 20% chance that that's going to happen in any given year. So again, we have to use a combination of methods, but it is a whole-based approach. It's not just in the water industry. It's around everything we're doing around climate science in order to better manage how we are able to respond and to adapt.
And I think we should set the table a little bit with an explanation of what those projects actually look like. And I want, Adib, could you talk about the really cool work you've been doing with the Beirut River Project and how you see your work as a solution for multiple different problems? And we've got some visuals here as you get going.
Sure. So I started working on the Beirut River, which is our capital's only river. It was encased in concrete in 1968, so it was transformed into a sewage infrastructure, basically. It cut the communities and the public space was lost. And so what we started doing is we did a lot of advocacy work over 7 years, which didn't actually lead anywhere. So we came up with the idea of doing something that was very practical. So what if we were to restore the forest ecosystem which ran alongside the river? And this is what we did with the communities. So we empowered communities to reclaim those degraded lands alongside the concrete river, transform them into green public space. So people are coming back now to those once unloved areas. They discover by themselves the smell of the river, the concrete wall, and then they start asking questions. So we're actually also giving them agency to work on climate mitigation projects because they're doing the work by themselves with their own bare hands. So it's there's so many different levels, but these urban forests are helping in climate change mitigation. So this is, you can see, this is our pilot project. The site is about 20,000 square feet. The Beirut River is at the bottom. This is sewage, pure sewage that runs through it. And the more green part is the part that we did back in 2019. And then the part to the left of it was done 2 years later. So you can see how in 2 years' time, there's a very quick transformation. And now that site, we're extending it alongside the river. And we've started on a site which is 10 times bigger. So if you look at I don't know if you're scrolling. Yes. So this is the before and after. So this is just a transformation in 2 years' time. We went from an urban landfill, completely dead soil, had the community come in, clean up, send everything for recycling, and then plant saplings which are about 10, 15 centimeters tall. So they go from 10 centimeters to about 2 or 3 meters in just 2 years' time. These are all native species, 24 different types of native species that are planted there. So it's a whole forest ecosystem that is being restored alongside all the biodiversity that will then be attracted back to this place. And they become self-sufficient in just 2 to 3 years' time. So no watering, no maintenance, absolutely no chemicals or pesticides required. And then last picture is our involvement with the communities. So anything from working with school children, elderly populations who come and who are planting with us, and then they remember their times in the village when they used to forage for medicinal species, and then they see us planting these species, and they are actually planting these species back in the city. So it gives them also, it reconnects back to that cultural heritage as well.
I think that's the perfect segue, almost like we planned this, to talk about the role of community in green infrastructure, which in our conversations while we were planning this talk really came up as a really strong theme of these projects allow the community to get involved in a way that you don't see with a typical gray infrastructure project. So Rachel, would you talk about what you've learned in the process of another big project, Green or Gray, in Miami, our Back Bay study, and what you've heard from the community about what they prefer out of these projects?
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And Alex has written about this project as well, so she knows it well. So I think this is something of a cautionary tale of maybe how not to do a resiliency project. But sometimes we learn even more from things that didn't go well, and it potentially has a happy ending, and we were able to pivot into more of a success story and how to work with the community to get these projects done. But here in Miami, after Hurricane Irma, Congress authorized a major Army Corps study to figure out what to do to protect Miami from storm surge, because we had a lot of damage, particularly in downtown, from storm surge. So amazing news, billions of dollars potentially of federal investments to make Miami more resilient. Everybody's thrilled. Jump in, participate in public meetings, write letters, try to make our voices heard. But pretty much from day one, the Army Corps came and said, we're definitely going to just build a wall. The only question is how high. And sure enough, although, to answer your question, Alex, almost all of the community members that participated were asking for green infrastructure to be part of the solution, it ultimately was not. And after this 3-year process, and I think we can show an image. Pause. Okay, well, I can keep going. There's
something that was interesting to me is the way that not just that some community members really preferred green infrastructure, it was the majority of comments, like the physical comments given to the Army Corps over and over again. Okay, here we got our images now.
That's absolutely true. And I think something important to remember, too, is that the community is not homogenous. Everybody does not have the same opinion about how we should proceed. but it was remarkably homogeneous in the support for green infrastructure in this case. So this is the coastline down Brickell. This is Biscayne Bay. This is one of the areas that was targeted for protection in the project. And ultimately, after 3 years of discussion, this was the ultimate plan that was put forward. So this is another lesson about the power of a picture, because I think this was a very powerful rendering to show what was actually written in words in their plan. And this was not just a 30-foot high wall down the waterfront. It was also a 30-foot high wall or varying height wall down neighborhoods. And so if you imagine your home right now, walking out of your front door, instead of seeing, a street or a sidewalk or your neighbor's house, you saw this wall. And you can no longer walk to your neighbor's houses and or even cross the street. That is pretty horrifying, and what actually some people realized as part of this process, that there were lines drawn in front of their houses on maps. And not only that, you may be on the wrong side of this wall. So this study very much picked winners and losers, and you may have been on the side of the wall that was not getting the flood protection as well. So it was problematic for many reasons. How did we get here? Well, green infrastructure would seem to be the best win-win-win situation ever. You get your storm surge protection, but that's not all. You get heat reduction and coastline protection and recreational opportunities and fisheries and water filtration and so on and so forth, of all of these things that we need. But one of the major reasons that we end up with gray infrastructure more often than not in these, big, especially federal infrastructure projects, is the way that we fundamentally calculate cost-benefit analyses in these projects. And I'm wildly simplifying this. But basically, how much property value can we protect for the least amount of money? And when property value is really the only benefit that you're looking at, we can imagine there are a lot of problems that stem from that. And namely, the higher property value areas are going to get more federal investment. And you're going to have an uneven distribution of federal resources throughout the community, and potentially the communities that are lower income, lower property value are not going to get the support that they need for resiliency projects and other infrastructure projects. Not to mention, we're missing all of the other benefits that may come along with a green infrastructure project that are just not being quantified and not being given any value in the process. And even if you are only looking at property values, that is not going to help anyone's property value, which is why the Downtown Development Authority got this rendering done, because they were very opposed to this project and what it could do to the downtown, even though it purported to offer this additional protection. So after 3 years, with a lot of community engagement and support, Mayor Daniela Levine Cava pushed the hard reset button on this project, thankfully, and we got something sort of unprecedented from the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a redo. And we are now in this 1 year go, no go at the end of this 1 year process, where we can answer the question, okay, we don't want a wall, what do we want? And that has been what we have been engaging in over the last year. We have had multi-day charrettes. In November, we just had one, I was there last week, sitting down and having the most open conversations I've ever had in these federal settings, and feeling really hopeful about the new progress that we are making, that potentially we can take this multi-billion-dollar federal investment and make it something that benefits the community and the environment and protects us by using green infrastructure. And the next slide will show you very early stage renderings, i.e. hand drawings, of what a plan could look like. And instead of using the wall and picking winners and losers, really protecting the entire coastline with multiple defenses, going from the reef and moving inward, using where we are very blessed with lots of natural ecosystems that provide coastline defenses naturally, incorporating that into the system and into the plan. So stay tuned. We have to decide by August. The county will get together with the Army Corps and decide whether or not we have agreement on a way forward, and then it will be on to the details from there.
story where you actually, hopefully we'll have a success story in a few years, but pause for that. Shalini, I'd love to talk to you about your experiences working with communities and getting them involved early, and how does that affect what we end up with instead of involving someone at the very end? And maybe we could talk about that through the lens of a really exciting project you and I talked about earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. I mean, I think, Rachel, this builds directly on what you were saying, which is, what do we want? So many infrastructure projects start with what we had, and I think all of you in this room are here and hopefully excited as much as we are, because we don't want what we had, right? We want something better. So how do you frame that early in a process? How do you build something that you actually need and want, and that's durable and that meets the needs of community? You have to start with different questions to generate different types of projects. So I'm going to give an example from the city of Hoboken, which, for those of you who haven't been in the charming city of Hoboken, it is a 1 square mile postage stamp of a city across from New York City. In 2013, during Hurricane Sandy, or 2012, the city was under 12 feet of water. It was basically built like a bowl and fully paved. So not all that different than the renderings that Rachel showed. We went to work with the city shortly after the hurricane, and everyone was still pretty shell-shocked. It was very, very traumatic to try to think through, how do you deal with what you need next when the now is so bad, immediately in the aftermath of a hurricane. And so we had multiple very gentle conversations with local government. And we said, well, what do you want to build to become more resilient? And the first 3 times we asked, the answer with increasing ferociousness was flood pumps. Like, look out the window, flood pumps. And so we finally said, well, after the water goes away, what do you want? And then all of a sudden we got these great answers. It was, well, we don't have any green space. We don't have a lot of parks. We struggle. They had cars floating down the streets for weeks. And so they said, we want parks and parking and flood protection. And so our team sat with the city. We sat with the water utility. And on the back of a napkin, we said, well, why don't we combine these things? And so we took a 6-acre site and did the very earliest stages of widening the imagination on what a nature-based solution looks like. And so we designed a bathtub. We said, if your cars are underwater anyway, why don't we pay for this infrastructure with a parking garage? You can fill it up with water when you're underwater, and the cars are going to be wet either way. And when it's dry, they can help you pay for upgrading the water system and reducing your flood risk. Today, the city of Hoboken has completely taken this baton and run with it. They are about to open a 6-acre park called the Northwest Resiliency Park. I can't see the screen, so I'm hoping you all are seeing. Oh, we're in Detroit, so let's move. So I'm describing for you a 6-acre park. They took this idea of a bathtub, created acres of green infrastructure that are built like a sponge, a layer cake of things that now are going to provide the largest green space the city has ever had, and reduced flood risk for a whole bunch of properties where elderly people were trapped in upstairs apartments for weeks at a time without power. It's completely transformational, but it started with asking different questions. And so that's, I think that is the opportunity.
And I think we have our images pulled up if you want to talk a little bit more about them.
On the slide that you see here, you'll see that this is now a whole bunch of recreational space, and what's not visible underneath is that it's built completely like a sponge. Most of this is green stormwater infrastructure with cisterns below, and the whole park is designed to basically avoid needing to build multiple flood pumps and add new water treatment capacity. So the city saved money and recently received $10 million as the final phase of this project. So this is a $90 million project, and the road not taken was 2 $5 million pumps. This is what's possible when you start with what you want instead of what you had.
And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about what these projects look like when they're implemented, because Palencia's got a really interesting example from Detroit in the aviation neighborhood. And, you know, the way this project worked is it was completed just in time for some really historic rainfall and some rain events that you guys saw. And you were able to pretty much immediately witness the effect of these projects. So was it all a success? What did you learn when it first, you know, the rains came? And we're going to go back to the other.
So nothing is ever 100% a success for a multitude of reasons. I want to talk about the origination of the project because I think it's important. Rachel talked about cost-benefit analysis, and I want to set the scene for where this neighborhood is in the city of Detroit. In 2014, we had a 100-year storm. That was my first year in city government, meaning we had about 4.5 inches of rainfall in a 9-hour time frame. And so as we began looking at data, this neighborhood aviation subdivision kind of comes up on the map as a place that had had a lot of flooding. And this is circa 2016 when I actually began my post at the city's water and sewage department. And so we started thinking, okay, is there some sort of federal funding we can get to try to facilitate doing this project? So we look at the FEMA hazard mitigation funding because let's mitigate having this hazard occur. I'll set the scene for you. In 2014, Detroit was in bankruptcy. Directly across the street, and it's hard for me to tell which way at this point because I'm directionally challenged. But this neighborhood sits next to a city called Dearborn. Dearborn has the highest population of Middle Easterners outside of the Middle East. Housing stock on Detroit and Dearborn side are identical. You got a bungalow, I got a bungalow. You got a colonial, I got a colonial. Your house is brick, my house is brick. The houses are the same. The houses on the Dearborn side were worth in excess of $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 in 2014. The houses on the Detroit side, where the population is majority Black, were worth $10,000 and $15,000. I can't make a cost-benefit analysis work for this because the property value in Detroit is not valued. But I just told you, same housing stock. So we began to just kind of think about, well, what can we do? This is also why it's important for people who run your utilities to be from your city. So I immediately say, well, you know what? Oakman is a boulevard. This aviation neighborhood sits on this street called Oakman, and it's a boulevard, which means it has a median in the middle. Can we utilize the median to manage the stormwater? And so the design team looked at me and said, okay, we'll figure it out. We'll try to figure it out. And they did. They figured it out. And so around, I think it was the pandemic, 2020, you know, you lose some years during the pandemic. Summer of 2020, it was completed. Everything was in. We had multiple bioretention gardens in the median. You can go to the next slide. We had multiple bioretention gardens in the median. So it's not just grass anymore, right? It is a very intricate planting where we have these subsurface storage devices as part of this. So on the top for a neighbor, it just looks like shrubbery and some mulch. But there's a very intricate system beneath this that is managing and storing stormwater. And so for me, June of 21 happened. Did I save every basement in this neighborhood? Did not. But what we did do is had way less basement backups as a result of this. What's important to note about Detroit, similar to many other older urban communities, is that it's a combined sewer system. What you flush down the toilet and what runs off your rooftop end up in the exact same pipe. So when you have a backup in cities like this, you're not just getting stormwater, you're actually getting sewage as part of that backup. And so it was very important for us to figure out what was going to work. There are probably some things that are going on right now to modify parts of this design, right? Because practice makes perfect. You have to see something perform. Just because you design something doesn't mean it got constructed right. And I think that's a key piece of green infrastructure for those practitioners who are in the room and even those who aren't practitioners. The construction matters. How you designed it and everything that you specified has to be done pretty much perfectly, flawlessly, because we're using gravity, right? high to low, high to low, right? We're using gravity to make water flow into these practices. So one little thing being off, you may have water ponding. And so it was funny. A neighbor came out that day. He saw me and he said, "Oh, this didn't work, did it?" I said, "Well, it did. It did. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It wasn't designed for the 1,000-year storm we had in June of 21 that was 7.5 inches. This particular area got 8 inches of rain, 6 of which fell in 2 hours. It was not designed for that. So when I got out there and then see a bunch of ponding at 8 a.m., 9 a.m., and the storm finished at 4 a.m., for me, it did exactly what we expected it to do. And these projects are not isolated. I can't push this out to a river. It's going back into the combined sewer system. So it can only do what the system at large is doing. It can help shave down or slow down how fast that rainwater hits the combined sewer system, but it still has to get into the system. And if that system backs up, then this backs up and so forth and so on. So this project, was still a hallmark because we took a neighborhood that nobody was looking at, nobody was really thinking about. We couldn't understand why it flooded in 14 in the first place. As we call it, the hydraulics didn't make sense, right? The high and low didn't make sense at the time of why it flooded. And then that has spurred additional conversation about other things that will probably happen as part of managing stormwater in the future, just in this general neighborhood.
We just heard a lot about the ways that government can, use these green infrastructure projects to sort of make things better for their communities, and that's awesome. But that's not always the dynamic that everyone has. So, Adib, can you talk a little bit about, how you have sort of persevered with your work and your projects and your community in spite of government? I think the word you used was guerrilla in one of the times we chatted.
Yeah, exactly. So, Lebanon is a very different context. We are actually in a failed state. There is no government. We don't have a president at the moment. Nothing functions. And so the government really does not care about this type of work that we're doing. They don't have a kind of accountability towards citizens. And so you cannot just come to them with facts and say, this is it, and this is what we can do, and this is how you can save money. And this is how you can protect people in the urban areas, because they really don't care about that. So, and you also cannot really necessarily get permissions. There's no policy around these types of things. So the first part of our work around the Beirut River was about 6 to 7 years of advocacy and fighting and screaming and, just dragging people to come and see, the state of the river, speaking at international conferences, everyone clapping, but then nothing actually happening. Trying to get in touch with different municipalities, with the Ministry of Environment, with the mayor of Beirut, who did not even recognize that there's a river in Beirut. It's like, there's no river in Beirut, but it's called Beirut River. So that was the kind of level of not caring. So at the end of the day, I kind of went through a burnout period for about a year, and then so I'm a part of an Aspen fellow, Middle East Leadership Initiative fellow. So we had this venture that we needed to do as part of our fellowship. So I decided to pick that back up and look at it from a different lens. And I decided to do something very practical. And in doing that, it's like, how do we bypass these systems? So to do a multi-million-dollar project on renaturalization of the river, that was not going to happen. So what can I do at my own level and with my team? And we decided to just reach out to local governments, so just to the municipality. And we picked a land which is the buffer zone of the concrete river, so that we knew that it is not supposed to be built at any point in time. So we were safe in that manner in terms of choosing that. And instead of going through the regulatory process and permits and all of that, we just signed an MOU with the municipality and embarked on this with the community. We did the same thing during the revolution. We just went into the streets. People were fed up of not having green public space. So we just started digging in the streets and then having planting these native species, explaining to passersby, people who were there demonstrating. They were starting to understand the importance of native species and how you can have that agency to reclaim the space and reclaim it with the proper species and the proper types of projects. So again, this river, all of the sewage, industrial waste, solid waste is all going into the Mediterranean Sea. So it's it's a local problem, but it does have a global impact. And for us to bypass these systems, we're like, we need to think globally, but we need to act locally on a very small level, as much as we can do on our own, and start with a tiny pilot project. So we started 2,000 square feet. Now we're at 30,000 square feet, more than 7,000 trees and shrubs planted in that area. And then every year doing this again and again with the community. We fly under the radar, so we don't necessarily do much press locally and all of that. And then in the hopes that they don't catch on to what we're doing until it's too late.
So on the note of obstacles to making more green infrastructure happen, obviously you, I think, maybe have higher walls than the rest of us do to scale. Here, let's go back to the US for a moment. Rachel, what do you see as one of the main things that's holding us back? Do we need more data? Do we need more science? Do we need the Army Corps to understand combined benefits? What do you think are the issues, and where would you like to see movement?
So as intractable as the Army Corps may be at times, I wouldn't describe them as a failed state. So I kudos to you for getting your project done in those conditions. And I feel a little bit guilty complaining about the Army Corps now, but not that guilty because they are very intractable. So I think until we can fix the way that we're valuing benefits in these projects, we're never going to get a fundamental shift in how they're approached. So fixing that systemic issue, I think will fix projects across the country and will tilt the whole pendulum more towards looking at these additional benefits, communities, environment, and will lead more towards the green infrastructure projects. And I think that if we add in those other benefits that are not just nice to have, they actually have monetary value to us as well, the economic case will be made for the green infrastructure to get built in these large-scale projects. I think what I keep hearing in these meetings is, oh, but that doesn't work. And then you sit in an academic setting and you learn about green infrastructure and you see study after study and example after example showing that it works. So somewhere there's a disconnect between what the science is showing and what academia is saying and what the community is saying that they want, and getting that actually incorporated into projects that are being built. And I think coming up with clear metrics of what is the value of this wetland, a mangrove, a coral reef per unit for flood risk reduction, I think is really valuable. And they actually, I don't know how many of you were in the plenary this morning, but it was talked about a little bit in terms of insurance companies are starting to try to do this. And I think that's a great way to incorporate the corporate world as well, because they have these models for risk reduction, and somehow getting that into the process, I think, will be very helpful and beneficial. And then just having more examples on the ground, like some of the ones you have all shared, of how this works. We can do this. And some of it's just in a stasis, and we need some inertia to change the way things have always been done, because people are very comfortable building the same old seawalls. We know how to do it. We know how to permit it. We have expectations for when it will work and when it will fail. But to do something new is to blaze a trail through this whole regulatory process and to do something that may not work. And it's very difficult on the ground to get people to invest large sums of money that we're talking about in something that is new. And that's where I think these pilot projects are very important to demonstrate this on the ground. But then we've got to figure out how to scale things in a way that can really make an impact. And I will also say, after 50 years, this gray infrastructure is getting replaced and is breaking down, and that's expected. But in 50 years, the green infrastructure is really just hitting its stride and is in full bloom, so to speak, and providing its maximum benefit and only getting more impactful and beneficial. So that's another economic value on the green infrastructure side too.
Value side, $10 million flood pumps versus $90 million comprehensive holistic community center flood project. That's a lot of money. Where does it come from? And that's sort of your specialty. Do we need the research to back us up to be able to fund it? Like, where are we going to get this money, and what would help us get more of it?
Because I think one of the things that often gets forgotten is the status quo isn't working in a lot of places, right? And we tend to compare to what we have because it's familiar, we understand it. But we rarely ask, like, is this actually working? Is it doing what we want? One of the ways that we think about project design and think about finance is in a set of really simple questions that kind of help flip things around. And one of the questions I ask most often is, who loses money if this project doesn't get done? So in Miami Beach, a lot of individuals and a lot of insurance companies lose money. So then you can take that and say, well, who has the incentive to act, right? But you have to translate these things. And I think one thing that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions tend to suffer from is that we are getting a lot better about talking about the benefits. And there are a lot more studies about the benefits, but we're not translating those to the beneficiaries. Like, Palencia, this is why I love your work, right? You roll across the street and you know the beneficiary by name. You know the basement that didn't get moldy. That's a lot of what we do. And oftentimes what I'm doing is I'm using non-traditional colors of money. So rather than looking for funding that is tagged with climate resilience or nature-based solutions, what we'll do is say, you know, maybe in this community, the thing to do is reduce landslide risk. Well, how do you reduce landslide risk? You keep water off the hillsides. All of a sudden, you can use military funding to pay for green infrastructure. Transit systems and heat are the issue ahead of us. Oftentimes, when you ask who loses money, the transit system itself is hemorrhaging money on the hottest days of the year, because what they have to do for their insurance is run fewer trains and run them more slowly. I want you to think about this. Your product is transit, and you're making less of it every time it's more than 95 degrees out in many, many, many cities across the world. All right? This isn't about finding new money to pay for projects. You're hemorrhaging the money off your balance sheet. Look at that first. So a lot of times what we do in the case of Hoboken, for example, we took two different kinds of projects and put them together. Said, if you're going to collect parking fees, let's make it pay for flood protection instead of disappearing into the parking budget. None of this is rocket science. None of it is high finance. Anyone who wants to talk to you in jargon needs to go back to two simple questions. Who loses money if we don't do this better? And who suffers if we don't do this right? And that's how you also finance these projects and make them equitable. So I want you to go back to picturing that train that doesn't come on the hottest day of the year. Who's left out at the station? That's an elderly person. That's a transit-dependent worker. It's my grandmother. Building a better shelter could look like a resilience project. And I think that is a complete failure of imagination and finance, right? We should be looking at where the money is falling out of the system and using that to pay for retrofits, to run more trains faster and put trees along every route.
I want to end there, but we can't. So we're going to come to you guys for some questions in a minute, but I'm going to throw a gigantic question at all of you, and I'm going to ask you to answer it in kind of small, short ways. So something that came up multiple times that we ended up talking about, building off exactly what you just said, is the way that these projects, if done correctly, can solve for inequity, but if done incorrectly, can reinforce inequity in our communities. So I would just love to hear from each of you. We can go down the row of the way that you see these projects as a solution, or dangers that you've seen if someone does them wrong. So we'll start with you, Palencia.
So particularly in Detroit, folks are distrustful of government. It was post-bankruptcy. So there was a lot of engagement required to get people to want to try something different. And I think the biggest piece about what makes green infrastructure successful is you're engaging directly with community. You are having conversations with them. They are giving you their input, and it makes all the difference. But again, people of color particularly, have concerns about being guinea pigs. So you also now have to talk to them about where these types of projects have been done before and give them really great examples. One of the last projects I finished working on, The neighbors were quite upset when the city had come 15 years before, was going to do a project, and that project fell apart. And for financial reasons, which is why most of these projects will fall by the wayside. And so we had to go door to door and have some really in-depth conversations with that community and then show them examples of things we really had done in this short amount of time for green infrastructure that actually were working. And it completely changed their minds about what they wanted. And they were very supportive of the project. They're probably not as supportive now because it's in construction. Construction is never fun, but we were able to change their minds. They also helped us persuade another city agency about where a pipe should go or where a pipe shouldn't go. And so once you engage them, right, you really create the momentum you need to complete the project. But it has to be done right, and you have to have very tangible examples. And I think, for me, that was always a thing for me. And I would tell my designers and my contractors, these people know me. I don't get to go to another city and tuck away at night and nobody sees me. These are my neighbors. These are my friends' parents. Every neighborhood we worked in, trust and believe I knew somebody. So for me, it was very important to maintain that same level of trust with those communities from project inception to project completion.
Definitely. I mean, this idea of trust is so important. I mean, in one of our projects that did not work out, we in the aftermath of the explosion that rocked Beirut in 2020, we were very eager to do a forest in a neighborhood that was very much impacted by that, and as a way to get community working together and all of that. But we knew going in that the municipality we were working in was not reliable. But we said, you know what, let's just give it a shot. And actually the project did not, I mean, the trees did not grow, they did not survive very well because there was no proper watering that was being done. So the watering was the only component that we could not control ourselves. And that really, I mean, we took a hit in terms of our credibility and the trust that people had given us in terms of like going into their neighborhood and doing this project. Because at the end of the day, they know the government is dysfunctional. So when you're coming into a neighborhood and then you're saying this is what we're going to do, then you can deliver on that. So that's like, so yeah. So we don't jump into these sorts of project as eagerly anymore. We really make sure, as much as possible, to work with people and with local government that we can trust.
And I think I've mentioned this several times already, but that cost-benefit analysis, just looking at property values, is going to lead to exacerbated equity issues every time, by design, essentially. So an example of how this manifested itself in the early stages of this project, again, this is now not happening, but we saw lower income communities having the wall down the middle of the neighborhood, but some $20 million homes on the beach getting elevated with public funds. Because you elevate one house, you get a huge property value benefit from that. So that's kind of where these formulas can go awry. But I also think that there can be a real lack of trust through the process. So us as an advocacy organization trying to get the community to be involved in these processes. For 3 years, we're telling people, come to these meetings, submit your comments, make your voice heard. And then at the end of the day, we end up with the wall and none of the suggestions are incorporated. Is very disheartening for people who gave time, their free time, to participating. And, it's my job, so I show up and I will continue to be annoying throughout the entire process. But for other people, that's, a big sacrifice. And then to go to them and say, now we have to go start all over again and come to these multi-day meetings again, that's very difficult for people, especially if it's not their job to be there and participate. So I think we do struggle with a way to have public participation that makes it easy for people to engage and to understand what's going on. And, when do you have the meetings? How many opportunities are there to go to meetings? What time of day are they at? Are they in the middle of the workday? Are they in the evening? Is there childcare? All of those things are really big considerations for making sure that we're finding solutions that work for the public. And I think that goes for this process, but really all government processes, I think, struggle with that and could really benefit from having better communication and better ways to engage.
Oh, I like everything that was just said. I think I'll wrap with one single point, Alex, on this one in terms of equity. How many folks in this room are in favor of scaling up green infrastructure and nature-based solutions? Yeah, me too. I think there's an incredible caution that needs to come with talking about the greater good when it comes to bigger projects. Because we fall into these traps of the greater good. The benefits are greater than the costs. And that is a doorway to disrespecting communities. It's a doorway to making these awful trade-offs when the property value doesn't line up. And so that to me is the important part of keeping who loses money and who suffers together as questions, right? Because that lets you target the hyper-local good, right? It's how do I make sure that ponding water doesn't breed mosquitoes in the poor neighborhood while every other neighborhood gets a beautiful park? So I think we need to be really careful when we talk about scale and make sure that we're talking about beneficiaries and not just benefits, and that we're talking about scale in terms of volume and not just taller walls.
Pick their brains. Who's got some questions? We have someone handing out a mic, so raise your hand and she can find you. Oh, one of ours. Oh, great. I see one right there.
Hi, guys. Thanks for putting on such a great conversation. My question has to do with the Miami, the Back Bay project with Army Corps of Engineers. And correct me if I'm making mistakes here, but the wall seems like it's meant to keep water out, and a multifaceted green infrastructure system looks, at least from an image, to allow water in and maybe to drain. So it's about dryness versus drainage. Maybe you could elaborate on, or maybe not. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Thanks, Bill. Bringing the tough questions. No, thank you. And that's a great question. I didn't even get a chance to really touch on this, but the congressional authorization for the project was pretty narrow. It was to look at storm surge, not sea level rise. So the daily sea level rise based flooding that we deal with here was not part of the project, and the Army Corps insisted that they could not consider that as part of this plan. You can imagine that's very problematic for those of you who are not living in Miami. You may not be aware we have, since 1996, had a measured 6 inches of sea level rise here, which may not seem like a lot, but that's resulted in over 400% more flooding events. Just that 6 inches. And we have this very porous limestone ground here. So water that you see on the surface in Miami is also underground in essence. And when we kind of brought this up, that you can't just put a wall there because the water is coming up from the ground causing flooding, we were told groundwater was outside of the scope of the project. So not only would the wall have been very harmful, but also probably would not have worked particularly well because of that. And so I think in looking at these projects, and I hope I'm answering your question, Bill, but I think we have to be much more holistic about the impacts and also whether or not we are fixing the right problem. Because looking at something in a very narrow box, and I understand there's a congressional authorization, you have to follow that. But a lot of times those boxes become narrower and narrower over time, and we end up solving for one tiny piece of the puzzle and missing the big picture, and then the projects end up causing a lot of other problems that we hadn't anticipated because we were using such a narrow lens. So for example, they proposed also sector gates or floodgates across the Miami River, and at the final hour after 3 years of looking at this, they said, whoops, we're actually going to flood Coral Gables if we do that during a storm. So now we have more floodgates in the city of Coral Gables and the Gables Waterway, and then so on and so forth, recognizing more and more impacts that come from building these projects without using, inappropriate scope.
Thank you to all of you. Adib brought up an important point in that wanting to build that forest, but realizing that no one was going to be able to water the trees. And I've read about that being an issue, I'm sure, all over the place, but specifically I read about it in LA. They were trying to plant trees, but they hadn't built in a plan for watering those trees. They were leaving it to the community to do it. And that was creating issues. So I was wondering if any of you had successful examples of models to maintain this green infrastructure, especially since a lot of this is things that cities aren't prepared or have ever interfaced with. They don't have an interface with an artificial reef, or maybe they're not prepared to maintain a giant mangrove forest. So are there any successful examples of this?
So typically for traditional green infrastructure, bioretention, things of that nature, you will third-party contract, right? Because you want somebody who can prune those specific species of plantings you've put down. You want someone who really can attend to the nature-based piece of the work. There are hardscape elements in green infrastructure, so pipes, other underground infrastructure, and those things were maintained by the department. But you have to be able to get the experts that you don't have on staff. And a lot of times in cities, the procurement process is very, what word do I want to use? Unimaginative or onerous. And so that mom and pop shop that would do wonders maintaining landscape, you can't get them because the insurance and the bonding requirements are so high. They're never going to be able to do that for a contract that's only $25,000 a year or $50,000 a year for 10 sites. So you do have to try to think outside the box. Cities who do it really well, Philadelphia has done an amazing job with how they maintain their green infrastructure, how they manage it, how it's in their asset management system, using the Power Core team, which is typically teenagers, younger folk that get trained and become the maintenance folks for their green infrastructure. So there are plenty of cities who do it well, but the how you do it, you're locked into some of the procurement issue or rules that may be in your particular city.
Really specifically. So 2 examples really specifically on how do you actually maintain nature to serve the function of infrastructure. So there, federal funding for projects doesn't pay for maintenance. So oftentimes you have the incentive to build something bigger to be able to get the project money, and then you're overbuilt for what you can actually afford to maintain. And so some of the 2 examples, the city of Milwaukee has done incredible things, and they created a kids don't try this at home zone for figuring out their maintenance called the Green Tech Station, where they actually created garden beds and put a whole bunch of different kinds of pavement down and figured out when you run salt trucks and snow plows, where do you clog up the water system? We need more of those experiments to figure out how to make maintenance more cost effective and to fix procurement. How do you know what to buy if you don't know if it works? The other one that I think is really fun on the funding side is the city of El Paso is, how many of you have spent any time in El Paso? All right, that's more than I expected. That's good. El Paso is incredibly dry. It gets a handful of inches of rain all year, and mostly it gets them all at once now because of climate change. And their roads are their water system. There isn't a lot underground, but that means when you get that much water all at once, you're washing away roads. Green infrastructure in El Paso actually creates maintenance savings because it makes the roads last longer. So when you ask that question of who loses money, turned out it was the maintenance department. And they were also blocking the green infrastructure projects in the city because they were like, enough with the beautification. Can't you see we're fixing all this flooding? So we went in and we said, look, this will actually keep your guys out of flash flood risk, reduce your workman's comp insurance, reduce your liability, and extend road asset lifetimes. So I would encourage folks who are thinking about these things at a really detailed level, look at existing budgets. Don't immediately go looking for new money. Look at existing budgets and figure out where you can create value and savings for those folks that you need to bring along anyway.
Just quickly, like in our case, we really look at minimizing the maintenance. And so the only thing we rely on with the municipality is to do the watering. But then sometimes we have to supplement their staff and their team with our own funding so that we can pay for the salary of this worker or the water truck to actually run. But the second thing is with the choice of plants. So we're working with native species. The methodology we use, which is the Miyawaki method. So it's a proven methodology that we're using. In 2 to 3 years' time, it becomes completely self-sufficient. So you could maintain it, to beautify it, to do all these things, but you don't have to. This ecosystem is going to thrive more and more, and it's not going to require water, which is the most difficult part to get on site. And we cannot give that responsibility to the community because they barely have enough to be able to deal with their own problems. So they help us in maintenance and all of that, but that's something that is not, we don't rely on them to do that, but we engage with them as much as we can.
What I'm understanding is that there's sea rise and there's surge. So you've addressed surge, and you've pretty much said that sea rise is a real problem because of the limestone. I mean, Miami Beach has raising the streets. Some people are raising their new construction, and they're trying to raise houses and buildings and so forth. Is there anything else that is a regional approach to sea rise for South Florida?
Yeah, so great question. I think definitely. Again, this project is looking at storm surge piece of it, although we are attempting to get the sea level rise aspect included, but we'll see how that goes. But regionally, what are solutions to sea level rise? I mean, it's an infrastructure problem, so it means updating transportation corridors, wastewater. We have 120,000 septic tanks here in Miami-Dade County and a high water table, so we're not getting the dry ground needed to properly filter the waste in the septic tanks anymore. Our sewage treatment plants are all coastal. They're very at risk from flooding. Our energy supply is our nuclear power plant that's also on the shores of Biscayne Bay that's very vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. So it's looking at all of the infrastructure and starting to not just look at quick fixes that are very tempting, but make long-term investments in infrastructure. And I acknowledge that this may be the most complex and possibly expensive problem ever, but there are innovative ways we can work on financing it and over long periods of time. There's another very interesting project going on right now. We actually have the most Army Corps projects here in Miami-Dade County in the nation. We have 6 ongoing right now here. And most of them are multi-billion-dollar projects. One of them is a part of the broader Everglades restoration plan. And one of the issues that we're having is this high water table, and we're basically out of storage. So there's a project called the BBC project, and I don't know if Elizabeth Carpenter's in the room. She's on the project delivery team for that project, but she's here somewhere at the conference. But it's the idea is to be able to move water that flows naturally from the Everglades out of the urban areas and into some of the more open areas that we still have to flow water to get fresh water into Biscayne Bay, which it really needs, because after the draining of the Everglades, we had all these water flow issues and salinity issues in the bay. And pretty much all of Florida, for those of you who don't know as well, is largely engineered. And so to be able to live here at all, there have had to be some of the largest ecosystem level drainage and engineering projects ever. So figuring out how to take these systems that were built in the 40s and 50s, not considering sea level rise, all the canals you see driving around, the reservoir ponds, and to make them work in coming eras of sea level rise for the future decades is a major challenge, and hopefully we'll incorporate green infrastructure, but some really large scale engineering needs to be done to really keep this area dry, because we are this thin sliver of dry ground here. But the BBC project, I think, is one of those projects that can look at ecosystem level, potentially mitigating flood risks. But another huge problem we have with doing green infrastructure projects here in Miami generally is that we have built right up to the water's edge, and everything is pretty developed except for a few areas in southern Miami-Dade County, which is where the project is being anticipated and planned for. But the next level question is, and actually we actually just got funding from the EPA to look at this, is how do we do the green infrastructure projects in an urban environment? And how do we look at every roadway and road end and park and swale as a part of this broader green infrastructure landscape with the canal systems that need to be redone, which is another major Army Corps project, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot going on, a lot of big projects in the works trying to answer that question. And I think we have, there are some things we have solutions for, and there are some things we're going to need to innovate for in the future too.
Please give my panel a hand.